we are continuing Module 2, Lesson 9. This is Part 2 on applying the properties of operations to add and subtract rational numbers. And we've been focusing on those associative properties, decomposing numbers or fractions and mixed numbers, as well as using that commutative property to make it easier. So looking at problem D, our very first step is I know that you're noticing that there are fractions and there are also decimals. And very often we want to immediately change those. And in this scenario, there's nothing wrong with doing that, but I recommend that we start and see if we get to a spot that we may not have to do as much as you think. So our first step is going to always be to take any subtraction, and let's go ahead and use that add the opposite. So 16/20, changing to plus, and that's the opposite is 1.8, 1 8/10, using correct language there, plus a negative 4/5. Step 1. So we did adding the opposite. All right. Step 2, looking at this problem, are there two numbers that you think work well together? And I'll tell you there are multiple ways to solve some of these problems. I'm going to stick with one right at this moment. Some of the first thing that I'm recognizing is that I have a positive and a negative with fractions. So I'm personally going to go ahead and decide that I want to group those fractions together using the associative property. So I'm going to move 16/20 plus a negative 4/5 together. Plus 1 8/10. So I am grouping those two fractions. Okay, when you reach this point right here, you may find that you want to go ahead and look at those common denominators. I'm going to currently stick with looking at one method. And the first method I'm going to come up with is I'm just going to make these both with a denominator of 20. So 16/20 plus a negative 16/20. So now that I am here, making sure we have a common language because we can't add fractions that do not have a common denominator. I'm noticing that I now have a number and its inverse. So I am forming that zero pair. And I will put on here common denominators. And this is going to cancel out or form 0. 0 plus 1 8/10, and I'm going to evaluate and get a result of 1 8/10. Now, in that problem right there, there are multiple ways you could have done it, and I've kind of made some notes here. So I'm going to put this up here. I use this method here. So I want you to notice that my step right here is identical. But instead of using the denominator of 20, maybe you recognize that 16/20 when reduced is actually 4/5. So you could have actually had 4/5 plus negative 4/5 plus 1 8/10. And then you would have ended up with the exact same result. So that's just showing an alternative. Now, in sitting and talking with the other 7th grade teachers, another teacher made a different connection, and I want to show that you could possibly have come up with a different connection. Now, one of the other teachers said, you know what, I look at that negative 4/5 And I immediately recognize that negative 4/5 is the same as negative 8/10, or the decimal 0.8. So I just showed another method of 16/20 plus 1 8/10 plus negative 0 8/10. So I just want to show that you also have this alternative method. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time showing those, but I wanted you to see that in math, you may sometimes take some different approaches, but you should have the same outcome. And as long as your approaches are always consistent and consistently correct, then it's okay to often do that. Now let's go to exercise 3. On exercise 3, explain step by step how to arrive at a single rational number to represent the following expression. Show both a written explanation and the related math work for each step. So kind of what we've been doing, we've been providing a written explanation, or at least categorizing each step. So my first step is going to be to take this problem and immediately see I've got some subtraction going on. So I'm going to add the opposites. Negative 24. So adding the opposite of a negative half would be plus 1/2. And then adding a negative 12 5/10. Okay, so step 1 is I first added, I first added the opposite. And I'm going to keep up with this written piece as we go along. Oh, goodness gracious, I started to write the wrong thing. Although they are definitely aligned. Added the opposite. Okay. Now, secondly, going back to the same thing that we've done in the past. I'm noticing something here, and yours may not look exactly like mine if you were doing it, but I'm noticing that decimal 5 is the same thing as a 1/2. So I'm going to rewrite this using a fraction. And now that I'm here, I'm seeing that I can definitely start to make some connections. So I just changed my decimal to the fraction. You could have gone the other way as well, folks. It would have been fine to change the fraction to a decimal. Now that I'm here, I'm going to go ahead and decompose. Negative 24 plus a 1/2 plus negative 12 plus, now remember that negative sign has to go with the half. So I have decomposed my mixed number. All right. Now that I'm here, I'm realizing there's some things that are in common. Okay, I notice that I have a positive, I'll highlight so you can recognize that. I have a positive 1/2 and a plus a negative 1/2. So I'm going to group those together. So I'm going to go ahead and just put right here. Okay? And then I'm going to group the other two together. All right. So now that I've done that, I want you to notice I've done some, that's using what property is it? Associative is where you're grouping. So it makes it easy for me. Now, very often you do these things in your mind as mental math. So a positive 1/2 and a negative 1/2 is 0. And negative 24 plus a negative 12 is a negative 36. So my final solution is negative 36. So I hope you're feeling a little more comfortable about decomposing numbers, using the adding the opposite, changing groupings by using the associative property, and then changing the order of numbers using that commutative property. And all of those methods will make solving these problems easier.